They say blood is thicker than water, but money is thicker than blood. In my case, a manipulative stepmother proved that greed can destroy families, steal futures, and turn love into a weapon. But she also learned that underestimating the problem child was the biggest mistake of her life. I'm Isabella Rodriguez, 28 years old, and this is the story of how my stepmother Margaret stole everything that should have been mine, and how I made sure she paid the ultimate price for her betrayal. My mother died when I was 8 years old. Cancer took her quickly, and my father, Antonio Rodriguez, was left to raise me alone. For 3 years, it was just the two of us against the world. Dad worked as a successful contractor, building custom homes for wealthy clients, and I spent my afternoons at construction sites, learning the trade alongside him. "This business will be yours someday, Maija," he'd tell me as we worked together. "Rodriguez, construction has been in our family for 3 generations. You're going to make it 4. I loved those years. Dad and I were close, and he often talked about how proud Mom would be of the woman I was becoming. We had plans. I'd finish high school, maybe go to business school, then join the company officially. The business was growing, and Dad had started buying investment properties with the profits. "We're building something here, Isabella," he'd say. "All of this will be yours when I'm gone. You'll never have to worry about money or security." Then, when I was 11, Dad met Margaret Williams at a charity gala. She was 35, beautiful, and recently divorced from a wealthy businessman. She had no children of her own, but she claimed to love kids and was excited about the possibility of being a stepmother. Margaret was everything my mother hadn't been: glamorous, social, and obsessed with appearances. Where my mother had been warm and down to earth, Margaret was cold and calculating, but she was also charming when she wanted to be, and my father was lonely. They dated for 8 months before getting married. I was 12 when Margaret became my stepmother, and from the beginning, I could see what my father couldn't. She was playing a role. Around Dad, Margaret was the perfect wife. She cooked his favorite meals, supported his business decisions, and talked about how much she loved being part of our family. She'd put her arm around me at family photos and call me her special girl in front of others. But when Dad wasn't around, Margaret was different. She'd make snide comments about my appearance, my grades, my friends. She'd forget to pick me up from school or buy groceries for my lunch. She'd schedule family activities when I had plans with friends, then act disappointed when I couldn't participate. "Your father worked so hard to provide for us," she'd say with a sweet smile. "The least you could do is show some appreciation instead of being selfish." The real problem started when I turned 14. Margaret began campaigning to send me to boarding school, claiming I needed more structure and discipline. She'd plant seeds of doubt about my behavior, my attitude, my future. "Isabella's becoming so difficult," she'd tell Dad. "She's disrespectful to me when you're not here. I'm worried about her influence on the neighborhood kids." Dad would confront me about these supposed incidents, and when I denied them, Margaret would sigh sadly and say, "I didn't want to tell you this, Antonio, but Isabella threatened me yesterday. I'm actually scared to be alone with her." I was confused and hurt. I'd never threatened anyone, especially not Margaret. But she was so convincing, so tearful that Dad began to doubt me. "Maybe some time away would be good for you," he said reluctantly. "Help you mature and gain some perspective." I begged him not to send me away, but Margaret had already researched schools and applications. By the time I started high school, I was enrolled at St. Catherine's Academy, 3 hours away from home. The boarding school was tough, but it taught me discipline, strategy, and most importantly, how to read people. I could see through manipulation tactics because I'd lived with them for years. I learned to document everything, to think strategically, and to plan for the long term. I came home for holidays and summers, but each visit revealed more changes. Margaret had redecorated the house, getting rid of most of my mother's belongings. She convinced Dad to hire a property management company instead of managing the rental properties himself, claiming it would give him more time to focus on the construction business. "Margaret's so smart about business," Dad would say proudly. "She's helped me streamline everything." But I noticed that the property management company was owned by Margaret's brother, and that Dad was now paying management fees for work he used to do himself. I also noticed that Margaret had become heavily involved in the business finances, taking over bookkeeping and client payments. "I have a degree in business administration," she'd remind Dad. I can handle these things much better than you can. When I graduated from boarding school at 18, I was ready to join Rodriguez construction as planned, but Margaret had other ideas. Isabella should go to college, she told Dad. She needs a real education, not just manual labor. What will people think if the owner's daughter is just a construction worker? Dad, who had always been proud of our family business, suddenly seemed embarrassed by it. Maybe Margaret's right, he said. You're smart, Isabella. You should use your brain, not just your hands. I was devastated. The business I'd grown up loving, the legacy I'd been promised, was suddenly not good enough for me. Margaret had successfully convinced Dad that I was too good for the family trade, while secretly ensuring I'd be kept away from the business. I went to state college, majoring in business management with the hope that I could eventually return to run Rodriguez Construction with proper credentials. But during my 4 years away, Margaret's influence over Dad grew stronger. She convinced him to expand the business, taking on bigger projects and more debt. She encouraged him to buy more rental properties, always through her brother's management company, and she slowly isolated him from his old friends and business partners, replacing them with people she approved of. When I came home for visits, I barely recognized my father. He'd aged rapidly and seemed tired all the time. He'd developed a drinking problem and was taking medication for high blood pressure. Margaret claimed she was worried about his health, but I noticed she was also the one buying his alcohol and encouraging him to relax with drinks after work. Your father works so hard, she'd say with fake concern. I keep telling him to slow down, but he won't listen. He's not as young as he used to be. I tried to talk to Dad about his health, about the business, about Margaret's growing control over everything, but he'd become defensive and distant. Margaret takes care of everything, he'd say. I don't know what I'd do without her. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. When I graduated college, I hoped to finally join the family business. But Margaret had convinced Dad that I should get some real-world experience first. She'd arranged for me to interview at a large construction company in another state, claiming it would be good for my career. You need to prove yourself somewhere else first, Dad said. Then you can come back and really contribute to our business. I took the job, but I made sure to visit home regularly. Each time, I documented the changes I saw. Dad was getting sicker, drinking more, and Margaret was taking on more responsibilities. She'd been added to all his bank accounts, made a partner in the business, and given power of attorney just in case something happened. The rental properties were all being managed by her brother's company, which was charging increasingly high fees. Several properties had been sold, with the profits going into accounts that Margaret controlled. I started keeping detailed records of everything I observed. I photographed documents when I could, recorded conversations, and built a file of evidence showing Margaret's systematic takeover of Dad's assets. The end came when I was 26. Dad had a heart attack while I was at work, and Margaret didn't call me until after he died. She claimed she'd been too distraught to think clearly, but I suspected she'd wanted time to handle things without my interference. I'm so sorry, honey, she said through fake tears. He went peacefully. He was so proud of you. The funeral was small, planned entirely by Margaret. She'd invited mostly her friends and business associates, few of Dad's old buddies. She played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences with dignity and grace. But the real shock came when the will was read. According to the document, Dad had left everything to Margaret. The house, the business, all the rental properties, his savings, his life insurance, everything. I was mentioned only briefly, receiving a small token amount of $5,000 and some personal items. I was stunned. Dad had always promised that the business would be mine, that I'd inherit his life's work. But the will was dated just 6 months before his death, and it was supposedly witnessed by Margaret's brother and a lawyer who drafted it. And I'm so sorry, Isabella, Margaret said with fake sympathy. Your father was very clear about his wishes. He felt you'd be better off making your own way in the world. I demanded to see the original will, but Margaret's lawyer claimed it was the only copy. I asked about earlier wills, but was told that Dad had never made any previous testamentary documents. I knew she was lying. I remembered Dad talking about updating his will when I turned 18, and again when I graduated college. He'd always said the business would be mine, but proving it was another matter. I hired my own lawyer, but without the original will or other evidence, there was little I could do. Margaret had covered her tracks well. She gave me 1 week to collect my personal belongings from the house. then changed the locks. I was effectively homeless, jobless, and broke. The stepmother who'd claimed to love me had stolen my inheritance and kicked me out of my childhood home. As I packed my few belongings, I found something interesting in Dad's old desk, a business card for a different lawyer, one Margaret had never mentioned. I called the number, and the receptionist confirmed that my father had been a client. Mr. Rodriguez did have a will with us, the lawyer, Maria Santos, told me, but Mrs. Rodriguez told us that he decided to work with a different attorney. She picked up all his documents about 8 months ago, so there had been another will. Margaret had retrieved it and made sure it disappeared, then had a new one created that gave her everything. But I still needed proof, and that's when I began planning my revenge. I moved back to the state where I'd been working and started building my case. I hired a private investigator to look into Margaret's background and her brother's property management company. What we found was shocking. Margaret had been married 3 times before my father, not once as she claimed. Her first husband had died in a suspicious accident, leaving her a substantial inheritance. Her second husband had divorced her after discovering she'd been embezzling from his business. Her third husband had also died young, again leaving her everything. The property management company run by her brother was a front for money laundering. They'd been systematically overcharging Dad for services, then funneling the excess money into offshore accounts. Several of the properties had been sold to shell companies controlled by Margaret at below-market prices. I also discovered that Margaret had been slowly poisoning Dad. The private investigator found that she'd been buying large quantities of certain medications and supplements that, when combined with alcohol, would cause the exact health problems Dad had developed. She'd been systematically destroying his health while positioning herself as his devoted caregiver. Armed with this evidence, I contacted the FBI. Financial fraud, money laundering, and potential murder were federal crimes. They opened an investigation, and I provided them with all the documentation I gathered. But I wasn't content to let the law handle everything. I wanted Margaret to experience the same betrayal and loss that she'd inflicted on me. I started by contacting Dad's old business partners and clients. I shared the evidence of Margaret's fraud and theft, showing them how she'd been systematically looting the business. Several of them had their own suspicions about her behavior and were willing to file complaints. Then I reached out to the families of Margaret's previous husbands. Armed with the evidence of her pattern of behavior, 2 of them agreed to have their loved ones' deaths investigated. The exhumations revealed traces of the same toxins that had likely killed my father. Margaret's world began to crumble. The FBI seized her assets, froze her accounts, and filed federal charges. She was arrested on charges of fraud, money laundering, and 3 counts of murder. The local prosecutor added additional charges related to forgery and theft. The will that had given her everything was proven to be fraudulent, and Dad's real will was eventually found in a safety deposit box that Margaret had tried to hide. In the real will, Dad had left everything to me, just as he'd always promised. The business, the properties, the savings, it was all mine. Margaret had stolen it through fraud and murder, but the law was finally catching up with her. The trial was a media sensation. Margaret, the grieving widow who'd seemed so devoted, was revealed to be a serial killer who'd murdered 3 husbands for their money. The evidence was overwhelming, and she was convicted on all charges. She was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Her brother was convicted of money laundering and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. All the assets she'd stolen were returned to me, plus damages for the emotional trauma she caused. But the best part was watching her facade finally crumble. In court, faced with the evidence of her crimes, Margaret's mask slipped completely. She screamed at me, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of destroying her life. "I gave you everything," she shouted as they led her away. "I was a good mother to you. You ruined everything." The woman who'd spent 15 years playing the perfect stepmother was finally revealed as the cold-blooded killer she'd always been. I inherited everything that should have been mine from the beginning. Rodriguez, construction, the rental properties, and substantial life insurance payouts from all three of Margaret's murdered husbands. I was suddenly wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined, but money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was justice for my father and her other victims. Margaret had spent years thinking she was untouchable, that her charm and manipulation would protect her forever. She'd underestimated the problem child she tried so hard to push away. All those years of boarding school, all that training in discipline and strategy had prepared me for exactly this moment. I rebuilt Rodriguez Construction into a successful business that honors my father's legacy. I established a foundation in my mother's name that helps children who've lost parents. I made sure that Margaret's crimes were widely publicized so that other potential victims would know what to watch for. Margaret is now 73 years old, serving her life sentence in maximum security prison. She writes me letters occasionally, still trying to manipulate me, still claiming she was a loving stepmother who deserves my forgiveness. I don't respond. She had 15 years to be a real mother to me, and instead she chose to steal my inheritance and murder my father. She made her choices, and now she's living with the consequences. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd been less observant, less determined to find the truth. Margaret might have gotten away with her crimes, leaving me with nothing while she lived comfortably off the money she'd stolen from her victims. But I was raised by a man who taught me that hard work and persistence pay off. Margaret thought she could manipulate and control me like she had my father, but she was wrong. The stepmother who tried to steal my future ended up losing everything. And I ended up with not just my inheritance, but the satisfaction of knowing that justice was served. Some people say revenge is wrong, that I should have just accepted the situation and moved on. But I disagree. Margaret was a serial killer who would have continued murdering innocent people if I hadn't stopped her. Getting my inheritance back was just a bonus. The real victory was making sure she could never hurt anyone else again. My father always said that family is about more than blood. It's about loyalty, love, and doing what's right. Margaret never understood that. She thought family was just another thing to exploit for her own gain. In the end, the family business she tried to steal became more successful than ever. The legacy she tried to destroy became stronger. And the problem child she tried to eliminate became the one who brought her down. Rodriguez Construction is thriving, and I've started mentoring young women in the construction industry. 4 generations of Rodriguez family members have built this business, and it will continue long after Margaret is forgotten. She thought she could steal my inheritance and destroy my family's legacy. Instead, she lost everything while I gained more than I ever dreamed possible. That's the difference between someone who builds things and someone who only knows how to destroy them. Builders create lasting legacies. Destroyers eventually destroy themselves. Margaret spent 15 years being the perfect stepmother, but it was all an act. In the end, her true nature was revealed, and she got exactly what she deserved. Justice may be slow, but it's thorough, and revenge, when it's justified, is absolutely worth the wait.